Well, welcome back, everyone, to part 18 of Ancient Mesopotamia, Portrait of a Dead Civilization. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Mesopotamian gods. What was the pantheon like, and how can we describe it in terms that are understandable to us some 2,500 to 5,000 years later. So we're going to look briefly at the names of the gods and the difficulties that are associated with identifying them. Some of the old or primary deities, the astral deities, and then other prominent deities that figure in the pantheon. Of course, we're not going to cover every Mesopotamian deity. That would take far too long and be extraordinarily difficult, as you will see. So the names of the gods. There is a very long tradition of changes that take place to the understanding, the Mesopotamian understanding of the divine throughout their history. So through syncretism, hybridization, and the plethora of local and minor deities, many names have been preserved, have been changed, have been modified throughout Mesopotamian history. These names were collected and studied in scholarly divine name or DN lists. And some gods are only known through their use in personal names. So people used the names of deities in personal names, and some of them are only preserved there. At times, deities were only mentioned or identified as the lord or lady of the city. But they're not identified by name, making it difficult, again, to study and identify them. But this leads to some of the ones that we do know a fair amount about. So some of the older or main or primary deities are An, Akkadian Anu, the sky god, whose temple was Eanna, of the house of An, the temple of An in Uruk. Enlil, who was the god of what Oppenheim calls the substrate region. So if you think about An being the sky god, and as we'll see in a moment, Ea or Enki being the god of subterranean waters, in the middle is what Enlil presides over. So he's over the earth and the region maybe of the lower sky. Maybe that would be a fair way to say it. But the god of the substrate region, whose temple was Akor, the mountain house of Nippur. An and Enlil throughout time become more misanthropic. So, particularly Enlil, you see him really hating humanity in a lot of ways, and he's sort of the antagonist in many of these myths. Enki, the god of the waters that surrounded the world. If you haven't seen our video on the Babylonian map of the world, I encourage you to take a look at it. It shows what we're describing here. But he's the god of the waters that surround the world and that exist beneath it. And his temple was the Eabzu, the house of the Abzu in Eridu. Prominently featured are the astral deities, so Utu, Shamash, the sun god. He had temples both in Larsa and in Sippar. The moon god Nana, Akkadian Sin. He is, of course, the moon god with his temples in Or and Haran. So just as a brief note, if you think about in the Bible where Abraham is said to have come from, he comes from Or, and he makes a brief stop in Haran. So I think that should clue you in to perhaps the deity that he primarily worshipped. Then there is Inanna. She is represents the Venus star. She is the daughter of An and the goddess of love and war. We've mentioned her any number of times. This is Megan's favorite deity, and her temple was the Eanna in Uruk. Finally, there are a couple of other gods that we want to draw attention to. First, Adad. He is the storm god. He shows up a lot, and there's a lot of modification to his name and his identification throughout the influx of Semitic people groups into Mesopotamia. So you'll see changes to his name, but this is the storm god. Ashur, the god of Assyria. And the interesting thing about Assyria and its priesthood is that Ashur identified the priest, his high priest, as the king of Assyria, which is very different from what we see in Babylonia. Marduk, who is the god of Babylon, and later in the first millennium becomes the primary deity, one of the two primary deities of the first millennium in Mesopotamia, alongside of Ashur. There is Nergal, who rules the underworld with his spouse Ereshkigal. And then finally Dumuzi, who we could say a number of things about, but he is a major theme in the lamentational liturgies and in lamenting in general in Mesopotamia. So, in summation, the Mesopotamian gods are difficult to pin down. It's difficult to identify some of the aspects of them, family ties, those sorts of things. There is a long tradition of changes throughout Mesopotamian history that makes this difficult. The old or primary deities are at the head of the pantheon, and the astral deities were prominently featured, including the sun and moon, the Venus star. Other deities were also influential throughout Mesopotamian history, though this varied to greater or lesser degrees, depending on the time and place. So, that's the Mesopotamian pantheon in a nutshell. In our next video, we'll take a look at the diviner and his role in ancient Mesopotamia as it pertained to figuring out what the gods were trying to tell the people. So stay with us. But until next time, resist poor scholarship. Always ask, how do you know that?